Story 1. Knock Knock. I'll never forget the fall of 2018. My father had gone away for a week-long business trip, taking my mother along with him and leaving me to take care of our dog Luna. I was 18 at the time and had stayed home alone before, so at first I didn't think it was a big deal. We had recently moved to a rural area, far from the city environment that I was used to. Our house was tucked away down a gravel road, surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. The isolation was both peaceful and unnerving at times. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, binge-watching TV shows, and occasionally venturing out to the nearest town for groceries. Luna kept me company, and I felt relatively safe in the quiet of our new home. At night, however, the house seemed much larger, the shadows more looming, and the quiet more suffocating. Nevertheless, I brushed it off and tried to pass the time until my parents arrived back home. One evening, about 4 days into my week alone, I decided to go for a run along the trail that wound through the woods behind our house. I loved running. It was my way of clearing my mind. As I ran, I noticed how still the forest was. The usual sounds of birds chirping or small animals rustling through the underbrush were absent, replaced by an unnatural silence. It was weird and a little bit creepy, but I just chalked it up to being paranoid. I reached the halfway point of my run and turned back towards the house. It was getting dark now, and I thought it best to get back while there was still some daylight left. As I jogged, I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. My pace quickened, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But there was nothing. By the time I reached the house, the sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I was breathless, not just from the run, but from the mounting anxiety I couldn't shake. After locking the door behind me, I fed Luna and settled in for the night. But as I went about my business, something felt off. Something felt different, and not in a good way. Around midnight, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like something scraping against the side of the house. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. At first I thought it might be a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal, but the sound continued, slow and deliberate. Luna took notice too and let off a low growl. Trying to calm her, as well as myself, I guess, I tiptoed to the window, peering out into the darkness. The porch light illuminated a small portion of the yard, but beyond that was nothing but inky blackness. Suddenly there was a soft knock at the front door. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially out here in the middle of nowhere? My heart raced as I crept towards the door. I stood still for a moment, listening. Then the knock came again, louder this time. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone. I didn't want to open the door, but I also didn't want to call the police just yet. I told myself it was probably just someone lost, looking for directions. I finally mustered the courage to call out, "Who's there?" No answer. The knock came again, more insistent. Luna was whining, indicating to me that something was really off. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Was it a burglar, a bunch of dumb kids with nothing better to do, or something worse? I backed away from the door and called my friend Josh, the only person I could think of, who lived 15 minutes away. He urged me to ensure the doors were locked, turn off the lights, and stay on the phone. Following his instructions, I secured the house, turned off every light, and sat on the floor in the corner of the living room with a kitchen knife. I remember my heart pounding in my chest. I was terrified. For what felt like forever, there was no sound. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I clutched the knife tight, and my knuckles were turning white with fear. Josh told me that he was on his way over and kept talking to me, trying to keep me calm, but I could barely focus on what he was saying. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again. A soft scratching at the back door this time. My body tensed, and I slowly crawled towards the kitchen, where the back door was located. The window in the door was small, but as I approached, I saw a figure standing just beyond the glass. A man. He was tall, his face obscured in the darkness, but I could see his outline clearly. Not knowing what else to do, I yelled out to him and told him I was armed, but he just kept staring, as if waiting for me to make the first move. Then, without warning, he slammed his fist against the glass, hard enough to crack it. I screamed, dropping the phone. Josh's voice called out from the phone, but I couldn't hear what he was saying over the sound of the man pounding on the door. I grabbed the phone again and shouted, "Hurry!" Luna was at a fever pitch now, and I was in a full-blown panic. I couldn't think clearly, and didn't know what to do or where to go. The pounding was relentless, and my mind was going 1,000 ways all at once. But just as I feared the glass would shatter, headlights flooded the yard. It was Josh's car. The man turned his head, and in an instant, he bolted into the woods. I remember putting both of my hands on the counter and shaking uncontrollably. Josh ran up to the front door moments later, and I began to feel a sense of calm ease back in. The police arrived shortly after, but the man was long gone. They searched the woods but found nothing. I never saw him again, and to this day I have no idea who he was or what his intentions were. Shortly after the incident, we installed security cameras around the entire property. Years have passed without any further issues, but that night remains the scariest experience of my life. Story 2. Missed Notifications. A little over 2 years ago, my wife and I bought a house in the countryside. We had always wanted to live the rural life, and this house seemed perfect. It was a nice 2-story home with a wraparound porch, a big garden, and acres of untouched land behind it. It felt like a fresh start after years of living in the city. My wife was a high-level executive at her company, and once or twice a month, she'd have to leave for a few days for conferences or meetings. I never minded being alone in the city. We lived in a high-rise apartment with security, neighbors close by, and a busy corner of the city that never truly slept. But out here in the countryside, it was different. When night fell, the quiet was absolute and almost overpowering. The nearest neighbor was almost a mile down the road, and once the sun set, it felt like we were the only people on Earth. One November night, shortly after my wife had left for a 3-day work trip, I settled in for what I expected to be an uneventful evening. It had been a long day of work and errands, and I was ready to kick back on the couch and relax. I remember the weather clearly. It was cold, and a light drizzle was tapping against the roof. The fireplace crackled softly, and both of our cats had curled up by my side. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. Around midnight, I started getting ready for bed. As usual, I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and turned off the lights. I've always been cautious, but living out here, I'd exercise an extra level of caution. Once everything was secure, I went upstairs to the master bedroom and crawled into bed, the cats following closely behind. I was tired, so it didn't take long for me to drift off to sleep. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but sometime deep into the night, I was abruptly woken by a sound. It was faint at first, a distant, muffled thud. I lay still, listening, convinced I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, this time louder. It sounded like something heavy had fallen, or perhaps something was being moved downstairs. My heart rate spiked as I strained to listen, my mind racing with explanations. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was one of the cats knocking something over. But they were still in bed, their eyes wide open, ears perked. They had heard it too. Another sound followed, clearer now, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. What in the hell is that? I thought to myself. I was wide awake by this point, my mind flipping through scenarios. Could someone have broken in? Was it an animal that had somehow gotten inside? I didn't know. I reached for my phone, trying not to make a sound, and checked the security app we had installed when we first moved in. There were dozens of notifications that I missed. I pulled up the app, and my stomach dropped. The front door sensor had been tripped at 2:13 a.m., about 5 minutes ago. Someone had come into the house. I felt frozen, sitting in bed, staring at the screen. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. Should I call the police? Should I check it out myself? Should I hide and hope for the best? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the sound from downstairs was unmistakable now. There was definitely someone, or something, in the house. Gripping my phone tightly, I quietly slid out of bed, careful not to alert whoever was downstairs. The cat stayed put, watching me with wide eyes. I tiptoed to the closet where we kept an old baseball bat, my hands shaking as I grabbed it. My plan wasn't clear. I didn't know if I was going to confront the intruder or just try to scare them off, but having something to hold made me feel a little less vulnerable. I moved slowly down the hallway, my bare feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. The house felt unnaturally still, except for the occasional noise from downstairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated, trying to muster the courage to go down. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, my bat raised slightly in front of me. The living room was dark, and I guess the tension of the moment made everything look unfamiliar. I stopped halfway down when I heard the dragging noise again. Closer this time. It was coming from the kitchen. I held my breath and listened. There were faint footsteps now, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was in the house was trying to move quietly. But the dragging sound continued, like something was being pulled across the tile floor. What in the hell was that? I inched down the last few steps and peeked around the corner into the kitchen. The light from an outside light barely illuminated the room. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I saw a figure near the back door. It was tall, hunched over, and appeared to be holding something, a large bag or object he was dragging towards the door. Panic surged through me. I didn't know if I should confront him, hide, or run. My hands gripped the bat tighter as I tried to calm my breathing. But before I could decide what to do, the figure straightened up and turned slightly, revealing an old, ragged coat and a hood pulled low over his face. In that split second, my fear turned to anger. This was my home, and someone had broken in. Without thinking, I stepped forward, raising the bat. My movement must have startled him because he dropped whatever he was dragging and bolted for the door. I yelled out as loud as I could, and took another aggressive step forward, giving chase. But then I stopped, deciding not to continue. Instead, I stood frozen in place, watching as he disappeared into the night, leaving the back door swinging open in the cold wind. Once he was gone, I ran to the door, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the deadbolt. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, the adrenaline still pumping through me. I called the police immediately, and they arrived within 15 minutes. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the intruder. The object the person had been dragging turned out to be a large bag. It was almost like a burglary kit. Pretty heavy, with all the necessary tools to break into a structure and to take things apart. Outside that, nothing else seemed to be missing, but the thought that someone had been in my house while I slept haunted me for weeks. Unfortunately, the intruder did well to conceal his identity, and there wasn't enough on the cameras to identify him. In the following days, I had more security cameras installed, inside and outside the house. It's been 2 years since that night, and thankfully, nothing like that has happened again. It was the scariest night of my life, one that I'll never forget. I'm thankful my wife was away and didn't have to experience it, and I'm thankful that I wasn't harmed. But I'll never forget that night, and I'll never forget the feeling of knowing someone was inside my house, just feet away, while I stood there helpless. Story 3. Solo vacation turned nightmare. A couple of years ago, I decided to take a solo vacation, something I hadn't done since I got married. My wife and I usually traveled together, but she was swamped with work that fall, and I felt like I needed a break from everything. Work, traffic, everything. So I booked a small cabin deep in the mountains of Colorado for a few days of relaxation. I loved the idea of being alone with my thoughts, surrounded by nature, and I figured a change of scenery would do me some good. The cabin I chose was isolated, which is exactly what I wanted. It was miles from the nearest town and tucked away in a forested area with nothing but trees and wildlife for company. The listing online described it as rustic and off the grid, which meant no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and minimal electricity. That sounded perfect to me. I wanted to completely unplug. I flew into Denver, rented a truck, and made the 2-hour drive into the mountains. The scenery was breathtaking, with towering pine trees and snow-capped peaks on the horizon. As I got closer to the cabin, the paved roads turned to gravel, and eventually I found myself on a narrow dirt trail that wound through the thick forest. The drive felt longer than expected, with the trees closing in on either side, but I finally arrived at the cabin around late afternoon. The cabin was small, just one room with a kitchenette, a wood stove for heat, and a loft bed. It had a rustic charm, with wooden beams and a large stone fireplace. Outside there was a small porch with a couple of chairs, and beyond that, nothing but dense woods. The quiet was almost overwhelming. No sounds of cars, people, or city life, just the wind and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I'd been craving. After unpacking and getting settled in, I chopped some firewood and lit a fire in the stove. The temperature was already dropping as the sun began to set behind the mountains. I made a simple dinner, opened a book, and settled into one of the chairs by the fire. It was peaceful, and I quickly lost track of time. By the time I realized how late it had gotten, it was pitch dark outside. The only light came from the flickering fire and the lantern I'd placed on the table. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the darkness of the woods. There wasn't even a moon to light up the sky, just endless black. A sense of isolation began to creep in, but I pushed it aside. I wanted solitude after all. Just as I was getting ready to head up to the loft to sleep, I heard a sound outside, through a window I had opened. At first it was faint, like something moving through the trees. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I didn't think much of it, but then the noise came again, louder this time, like footsteps crunching on the dried leaves just outside the cabin. I froze, listening. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. It was something else. Human footsteps. Someone was walking around out there. I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't see anything. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was staying just out of sight. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe a hiker passing through. But I was miles from the nearest trail, and it was well past midnight by now. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Then they started again, this time closer, much closer. It sounded like whoever it was had moved around to the back of the cabin, right where the small porch was. My breath caught in my throat. There was no reason for anyone to be back there. I grabbed the small flashlight I'd packed and switched it on, slowly making my way toward the door. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront whoever was out there? Call for help? But then I remembered. No cell service. I was completely cut off from the outside world. As I stood by the door, trying to steady my nerves, I heard a new sound. A soft thud, like something being dropped onto the wooden porch. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before slowly pulling it open. The cold night air rushed in as I stepped onto the porch, shining the flashlight around the area. The beam of light illuminated the porch, the front yard, and the trees just beyond, but there was no one there. I walked a few steps forward, my heart still racing. I swung the light toward the corner of the porch, and that's when I saw it. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with a piece of frayed rope, lying on the ground right by the door. It looked out of place, like it had been placed there intentionally. That's when the footsteps started again, louder now, circling around the cabin. Panic set in, and I rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and bolted the windows, my mind racing. Someone was out there, playing some kind of game, and I had no idea why. For an hour, I huddled inside, gripping the flashlight tightly. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping past the window, something or someone lurking just outside. The sight sent chills down my spine, but finally, I'd had enough. I gathered a few essentials, grabbed my keys, and mustered all the courage I could. When I thought the coast was clear, I made a mad dash for my truck, throwing my things inside as fast as possible. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away, my heart racing as fast as the wheels beneath me. As I drove back down the narrow dirt road, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, but didn't see anything. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. That night, I drove to the nearest town and rented a hotel room. The next morning, I returned to the cabin in daylight. The place felt different, not as ominous as it had the night before. I noticed the small bundle of sticks tied with frayed rope was gone. Had I imagined everything? Deep down inside, I knew that I hadn't. I gathered the rest of my belongings and left as quickly as possible, opting to spend the remainder of my vacation at a nice lodge I found. I never discovered who or what had been out there that night. For me, it was the last time I ventured alone into the wilderness.